This one is for the new writers in the room. If you write scripts for comics, then please watch this because you'll make your job and the artist's job a hell of a lot easier. Also, if you struggle with word balloons, this will help. We're going to break down the combinations of words and pictures into 7 categories. If you're new here, this series is based off Scott McCloud's excellent Making Comics book that I recommend you picking up. For those 7 categories, we've got word-specific, picture-specific, geo-specific, intersecting, interdependent, parallel, and montage. On their own, these categories might mean nothing to you, but that's why you're here, right? We'll start with the first category, which is word-specific. Word-specific combinations are useful for us to advance chunks of our story without slowing the pace down. This means that it is the words that are doing the heavy lifting for us. For example, if a specific period of time has passed from one scene to the next, you'd use words to indicate this. If a week has passed, you would simply add something like 1 week later instead of drawing a week's worth of imagery. But that doesn't mean the artist is being left out or not considered, because it's here where the artist can use a bit more imagination and creativity. The image you choose to go along with that 1 week later could make use of metaphors or symbols as opposed to a drawing of a character. Basically, it would be something that complements the words. On the flip side, picture-specific combinations allows the words a bit more license for freedom and creativity. In fact, in this combination, words may not be necessary at all throughout parts or even all of the sequence. Some comics take this to the extreme by having no words at all. But artists, before you get giddy with power at the thought that you don't even need a writer, you need to be wary. Having long stretches of imagery with no words can be a risk, because the reader may not be able to clearly interpret the imagery that you choose. A character looking off into the distance could mean a million different things. They could be thinking about love, regret, or be off their tits on mushrooms. The words are there to help contextualize what's going on, but the pictures are doing the majority of the heavy lifting in terms of telling the story. The duo-specific category of panels are most commonly seen in children's books. That's because this is where the visuals and the words are telling us the same thing. So you'd have the following scenario, for example. Billy gets a blue hat are the words, and the image is Billy getting a blue hat. They're both doing the same thing. Infographics do this too. Not necessarily relevant to comics, but kind of interesting. Anyway, let's move on because geo-specific panels aren't likely to be used much as there are better, more creative methods. Intersecting and interdependent combinations are similar but not the same. The intersecting combination are when the images tell one side of the story and the words tell the other. For example, the words can give an impression of a character's personality while the image tells us what they look like. The image here tells us he's a surgeon, but the words reveal a bit more about his personality as well as his relationship to the patient. If you take away the words, the reader may be able to figure out what's going on, or they may not. And if you take away the pictures, the same. They're partially dependent on each other. Now, interdependent combinations are exactly the same, except the images and words need to be together for the panel to work. They're 100% dependent, like in this panel here. With just the image, we don't know who she is or why she's important, but with the text, we can see who she is and why she is important. The parallel combination is when the individual images and words don't match up at first, but bring everything together later. For example, if some characters are discussing a plan to rob a bank and you start at the hideout, the conversation could continue as we transition to the bank itself. Another good example is when a character is narrating over some shots that don't include that character until a few panels in. In both cases, the words and images aren't directly linked, but we can see that they're still working together to tell the story. And finally, the montage. This isn't like a montage in a movie. This is more like when the words and pictures combine together. Most commonly, this would be a sound effect like boom.
Boom.
As an artist or letterer, you can be super creative and have the word make up the image itself. But it's not just with sound effects that you can use this. If you use chapter headings or you make use of the 1 week later transitions, then you can find creative ways of writing these into the scene. Maybe a shadow from an object forms the letters, or you have them written on a sign in the background. And they are the 7 different categories or combinations you can use in your panels. These are not necessarily strict, nor must they be adhered to all the time, but if you're struggling with the pacing of your story or you're finding it hard to visualize that next panel, then these categories really help. As I mentioned at the top, they help writers think more about the relationship between the words and the imagery. And with those categories in mind, we need to think about word balloons and how we're going to use them. There's a secret about word balloons that not many new comic artists know. The secret is that there is no right answer to word balloons. There's no one way that is correct. That being said, there are some guidelines that you should consider so that you don't confuse or frustrate your readers, and we'll come on to that. First, let's look at our options for different types of word balloons. The first option is that you could subscribe to this channel because I make videos like this all the time, once a week, and if you have even the slightest bit of interest in making a comic, whether that's as a webcomic, a one-shot, or a giant graphic novel, there are lots of videos here that will help make that easier and less confusing. So please subscribe because it really helps me reach more people like us. Now enough of that, let's get into the word balloons. The first proper option when it comes to word balloons is to simply not use them. Some artists hate them and find them to be a massive inconvenience and so just throw the text on the page as it is. The second option is to get a little weird with them. Make the white of the background offset or have them be another colour other than white. You could have the balloons with a border or no border at all. The third option is to go the opposite direction and intentionally establish a word balloon for exactly what it is, a word balloon. Most Western comics in particular use a traditional word balloon in almost every comic you'll read. However you want to show your word balloons is up to you. There's only one person who you're making this balloon for, and that's your audience. So as long as you're clear with them, then you can do whatever you want. Style of balloon to one side, we also need to consider the size. A lot of this largely depends on the size of the comic you're making, but generally speaking you want to be conscious of the size and quantity of those balloons. The size is an issue we explored in the categories earlier in this video. If your balloons are too large, then it can interfere with the story the images are telling, but the quantity is another thing that we need to look at. Let's say you have the following piece of dialogue. I'm really excited to meet Daz, but what if he doesn't like me? Now let's put that in one word balloon. Do you notice an issue here? What image are you going to use? Is your character going to be excited to reflect this part of the dialogue or nervous to reflect this part? The solution, as mentioned in my body language video, is to create two panels and split the dialogue into two different word balloons. You can connect the balloons across each of the panels or have each word balloon stand on their own. That's up to you. Another issue regarding quantity is having too much information. There is no magic number in terms of the number of words you can have in a word balloon, but if there is an entire paragraph of dialogue in one word balloon, you may end up boring your readers. They're there to read comics, which means they're a higher form of being. They want words and pictures, not just reams of words. So consider splitting the paragraph up into multiple word balloons that you can spread across the page, ideally in a way that follows the logic of the imagery. The final element of words in comics is the lettering. When it comes to lettering, you need to have a rough idea of how to use emphasis on certain words. You can do this in a few ways, such as changing the size of the font for certain keywords, putting them in bold, underlining them, or italicizing them. This naturally puts emphasis on those key words, so if a character is shouting something in particular, our inner voice will shout the words that have emphasis. Generally speaking, the bigger and bolder the word is relative to the others, the louder it is. Another question you may ask yourself is whether to caps or not to caps. This is another one of those things that are down to personal preference, but here's why caps are usually used in comics. The main reason is that the way the letters sit next to and on top of each other is uniform, and so there are no letters that are going to overlap with others. The case for using lowercase letters, however, is that it enables people to read the words more naturalistically, which means they can keep an even pace while reading the words. So choose all caps or lowercase, it doesn't matter beyond your own preferences, but caps is probably easier. As mentioned earlier, sound effects can be really fun and creative. They're typically more graphical in nature than the general letters, and so you can come up with lots of different ways of showing the effect on the page. An electrical sound effect would have a more jagged style to simulate electricity, whereas an explosion may have the words themselves exploding out from the page.
Boom.
The main thing to take note of is when you're creating those sound effects, have someone else read it and see if they can hear what you're intending for them to hear. No point in having a boom or zap sound if people can't read it. Just remember that when you're writing, you need to think about the visuals as far in advance as you can. A long action sequence could be conveyed in one panel or splash page, whereas dialogue that conveys multiple emotions may need to be conveyed across multiple panels. See my panel transition video for more about that. And finally, writers and artists are just as important as the other, and a comic can't work without them both harmonizing. Sometimes there's a bit of a writer versus artist mentality, particularly online, go figure, and so it's worth pointing that out every now and then. I've been Brinkley, have fun drawing, and I'll see you in the next one where we're going to talk about world building.